Crazy, demented, sadistic, and extremely perverse. That's how the most infamous of the Roman emperors is remembered. A boy who found himself at the top of one of the greatest empires in history at just 16 years old, Emperor Nero. But what's true and what's false in his story? All cultures around the world have considered it very important to study that period of enormous influence for today, which was ancient Rome. That's why today we're going to learn about this historic and hated figure. We're going to go over the dark legend that surrounds Nero with all kinds of strange vices, but also the successes of his government on the economic, military, and diplomatic levels. And how is he the architect of a small golden age in the history of Rome? Let's go through the life of Emperor Nero. Nero was born with the name Lucio Domizio in Avardo, in the region of Antium, which is now known as Anzio in Italy, a city located on the coast, about 53 kilometers from Rome. He was born on December 15th in the year 37 after Christ. The child who was born would become the last emperor of the dynasty, Julio-Claudian, the lineage that gave Rome illustrious rulers such as the renowned Julius Caesar and Emperor Augustus. His father, named Nero Demise, was a consul of Rome, and his mother, named Agrippina, was the sister of another extravagant and infamous Roman emperor, well known as Caligula. Nero's father was the great-nephew of Emperor Caesar Augustus, and served as a praetor and as a member of Caligula's personal guard during the then-future emperor's journey to the eastern provinces. According to the historian Suetonius, Nero's father was a murderer, and Emperor Tiberius ended up accusing him of treason, adultery, and incest. Nero's father died when his son Nero had just turned 2 years old. Nero's mother, Agrippina, on the other hand, was also a descendant of the former Emperor Caesar Augustus, as she was his great-granddaughter, and when Nero was only 3 years old. His mother was exiled by her own brother Caligula when he was already emperor, fearing conspiracies from her. In this way, after his mother's exile, Nero was entrusted to the care of his aunt, Domitia Lepida, a woman who apparently neglected Nero's education, to such an extent that it is said she entrusted the young boy's education to a barber and a dance teacher. Nevertheless, Caligula is assassinated while serving as emperor of Rome, and shortly after, Agrippina manages to return. There, Nero's fate would change, as his mother would marry the new emperor of Rome, named Claudius Claudius. In addition, he was the uncle of his new wife Agrippina, which meant that it was an incestuous and legal relationship. But there was nothing that the power of a Roman emperor couldn't make legal in the Senate. With this new marriage, Emperor Claudius adopted the then Lucius Domitius, Agrippina's son, who was now called Claudius Nero Caesar Drusus. The emperor already had 2 successor sons with his previous wife, Messalina, who, by the way, he had killed for conspiring against him. His children were named Claudia, Octavia, and Britannicus. However, by adopting Nero, the latter became the first direct successor to the throne, since he was older than Britannicus. In this way, Nero is proclaimed an adult at the age of 14 and is named proconsul, which was a kind of magistrate and governor of a Roman province. In this way, he enters the Senate for the first time at this early age. At the same time, he makes his first public appearances alongside Claudius, and coins are issued during his stepfather's reign showing him as the great successor of the empire. It is believed that Agrippina, Nero's mother, was a great opportunist and built all her relationships to gain power. Manipulation and influence over those around her for the sake of her political ideas were common for her. This dynamic, in the long run, would also make her own son Nero reject his mother. In the year 54 after Christ, Emperor Claudius dies, and at this moment Nero ascends to the emperor's throne. At just 16 years old. Ancient accounts from historians claim that Agrippina, Nero's mother, killed her husband Claudius so that her son could finally take the throne. However, there will probably never be absolute certainty about it. This is how the reign of young Nero began. According to these same ancient accounts, Agrippina had a great influence on the adolescent Nero in the first stage of his rule. His mother assigned him the famous Stoic Seneca and Sextus Burrus as tutors, who also had great power and influence over Nero's way of ruling. The first years of Nero's reign are remembered as a time of good and responsible administration. The affairs of the empire were handled in a coherent manner. Both politics and finances were in order, and the Senate enjoyed considerable independence when dealing with matters of the state. These were the golden years of Nero. Regarding his personal life, Nero, shortly before assuming the empire, was obliged to marry Claudia Octavia, who was the daughter of the former Emperor Claudius and was also Nero's stepsister, whom he married. The situation with his mother was becoming increasingly strange. Agrippina's influence over Nero was growing stronger and stronger, and the young emperor began to resent his mother. It is said that in the same year, 54, Agrippina tried to sit next to her son while he was discussing matters of state with an Armenian delegate. But Seneca stopped her in order to avoid a scandalous scene. In Rome, women did not participate in decisions of state. However, Agrippina intended to sit next to Nero as a sort of empress who made the decisions. Nero's close circle of friends and advisors, they start turning the emperor against his mother and warn him about her suspicious behavior, trying to pull the strings of the empire. According to historians, it is believed that the emperor's relationship with his mother was one of love and hate. Agrippina showed a lot of love to her son, but Nero suspected that she was using him for other purposes. About this love-hate relationship, the rumors recorded by ancient accounts even claim that Nero had sexual relations with his own mother, Agrippina. However, there is no certainty that this is real, a black legend invented about him. Nevertheless, everything that has been recounted is just a small sample of the complex world of intrigues, mistrust, and overwhelming passions that the ancient Roman Empire had become. And this situation also paints for us the dark environment in which Emperor Nero apparently lived, as a kind of introduction to his path toward madness and depravity. Nero, meanwhile, dissatisfied with his marriage to his stepsister Octavia, begins a romance with Claudia Actea. Claudia Actea was a freedwoman, as former slaves who had been set free were called in ancient Rome. When Agrippina hears about her son's infidelity, she tries to intervene on Octavia's behalf and demands that Nero stop seeing the freedwoman Actea. But Nero, supported by Seneca, resists more than ever his mother's interference in his private life. According to the historian Tacitus, Agrippina, seeing that she was losing influence over her son and could no longer control him, began to scheme so that her stepson Britannicus would become the future emperor of Rome. Nero certainly saw Britannicus as a possible threat to his power, and when Britannicus turned 14, the young man died suddenly and suspiciously. The day before his proclamation as an adult in Rome, according to Nero, Britannicus died of an epileptic seizure. But all ancient historians accuse Nero of having poisoned his stepbrother. The fact is that after the death of Britannicus, Nero and his wife Octavia expelled Agrippina from the imperial residence and accused her of being a conspirator. But beyond all these intrigues, Nero enjoyed enormous popularity, especially in the eastern part of the empire. Since the first years of his rule had been years of stability, prosperity, and growth for Rome. Additionally, both diplomatically and militarily, Nero showed excellent results in the conflict with the so-called Parthian Empire, which pushed his popularity even higher. In the year 55, the Roman vassal kingdom of Armenia overthrew its prince Radamisto and replaced him with the Parthian prince Tiridates I. The Parthians were a people different from the Romans, and the Romans considered this as an invasion of Roman territory by the Parthian Empire. Nero responded quickly and invaded Armenia with Roman troops, which established a temporary peace in the region. The Parthians counterattacked, but the Roman army repelled them. Armenia now became fully part of Rome, and Nero was publicly acclaimed when news of the victory reached Rome. On the other hand, his government's cultural policy was very striking, focusing on the promotion of the arts and the construction of theaters in various regions of the empire. At the same time, Nero's reign encouraged athletics and sporting competitions. This period of his government is remembered as a golden age for Rome. The economy was thriving, there was stability, culture, and sports were promoted, and the provinces were content. And in addition, the annexation of the region by Rome had achieved for Neron an improvement in the always tense relations with Greece. But beneath this golden era in the empire, political intrigues were stronger than ever. The alleged murder that Neron had committed against his half-brother would be the first of many. According to ancient accounts by historians like Tacitus, Suetonio, and Dios Cassio, Neron gradually became a power-hungry despot. According to them, the emperor began to obsess over his own image and became more megalomaniacal and paranoid. The emperor was convinced that there were multiple conspiracies from the Senate, and even within his own circle, to assassinate him and remove him from the throne. Which was not a lie, since this had become a vicious cycle in the Roman political dynamic of that time. Over time, he became more powerful, and Nero got rid of his advisors and eliminated his rivals. In the year 55, he deposed Marcus Antonius Pallas, an ally of Agrippina in the state treasury. Pallas, along with Burrus, one of Nero's close advisors, were accused of conspiring to overthrow him and put Faustus Cornelius Sulla on the throne. So these three prominent Romans were exiled, and Pallas would be killed in the year 63, presumably by assassins sent by Nero. For his part, Seneca, the emperor's other tutor, a highly respected philosopher and senator of that time, was accused by Nero of having sexual relations with Agrippina and of corruption. However, all the charges were dismissed. But from that moment on, Seneca and the other advisors reduced their political role, distanced themselves from Nero, and stopped trying to moderate him. Seneca had made many enemies as Nero's advisor and would eventually distance himself to a less prominent role. Likewise, Nero gradually took on more and more functions that supposedly belonged to the Senate. This caused him to become enemies with the Roman body and with several senators who ended up being killed or exiled. According to the dark legend of Nero, his obsession reached such a point that he began to plan how to get rid of his mother as well. In the year 58, Nero began a romantic relationship with Poppaea Sabina, the wife of a friend of his who would become a future emperor named Marcus Salvius Otho. Poppaea Sabina realized Agrippina, Nero's mother's intentions, and little by little she convinced the Caesar to do something about his mother. The account states that Nero planned Agrippina's murder with great dedication, as he did not want anyone to suspect. He tried to poison her several times and even to drown her on a boat. However, he eventually ordered her execution in the year 59 on charges of treason. This caused confusion in Roman society, and Seneca was one of those responsible for justifying this action by the emperor before the Senate. Allegedly, his mother was conspiring to place Gaius Rubellius Plotus on the throne. The truth is that this harsh measure helped Nero consolidate his power as emperor without dispute for a while longer. In the year 62, Nero's advisor Burrus dies, and Seneca, for his part, has to face another smear campaign against the philosopher Nero. Now he surrounded himself with flatterers who made him distrust his former teacher. So Seneca asks Nero to allow him to retire from public life. Nero eventually agrees. However, convinced by his new circles that Seneca was involved in a conspiracy against him, the emperor sentences him to death in the year 65, despite not having solid evidence against him. When Seneca receives the news that his execution had been ordered, he chooses suicide by cutting his veins. Going back to previous years, Neron decides to divorce his new wife, Octavia, and banishes her from Rome to be with his new lover, Poppaea Sabina. But seeing the angry protests that this action had caused among the Roman population, is he forced to call her back from exile? However, despite this apparently benevolent action, Octavia ended up being executed shortly after returning to the capital. Later on, with the goal of further consolidating his power, Nero executed a series of rivals between the years 62 and 63, including the already mentioned Pallas, Rubellius Plautus, and Faustus Sulla. One of the darkest episodes in the black legend of Nero during his reign was the Great Fire of Rome, which occurred in the year 64. Although the story surrounding this event is very vague, some historians, like Tacitus, claim that the fire destroyed at least 4 of the 14 districts of the Eternal City, leaving numerous deaths and architectural losses. The Black Legend claims that Nero was the one who caused this fire in order to accuse the Christians of the tragedy and persecute them. At that time, there were few Christians, but they were gradually gaining more ground in Rome. Likewise, Tacitus claimed that Nero was singing and playing the lyre in his palace while Rome was burning completely. However, another historian, Dion Cassius, asserts that Nero was in Antium, outside of Rome, during the fire. Despite the enormous historical discrepancies, the image of the calm emperor playing music while Rome was burning has remained engraved in popular imagination. Historiography itself states that as a result of the fire, Nero blamed the few Christians who were in Rome, and as a result of this, he persecuted them harshly and executed a large number of them. After the Great Fire of Rome in the year 64, according to some historians, Nero became more egocentric and megalomaniac. He made it his mission to persecute anyone who dissented in the Senate. The empire was no longer prosperous. It was suffering from an economic crisis worsened by the fire and a crisis of governance, while the emperor was concerned with his image and his extravagances. It's worth mentioning another terrible event that happened in his personal life, another alleged incident that was added to his supposed list of horrors. The accounts claim that in a fit of rage, Neron kicked his wife, Poppaea, in the stomach while she was pregnant at the time, causing her to have a miscarriage. There, Neron would have lost his heir, in addition to causing his wife a terrible hemorrhage, which would eventually lead to her death. The remorseful emperor was never able to forget her. According to legend, his obsession was such that he fell in love with a young slave named Esporo, who physically resembled the late Poppaea very much. According to the accounts, Neron ordered the slave to be castrated, forced him to dress like his wife, and married him. In addition to this aberration, it is said that Neron was a sex addict who practiced sodomy and loved to meet with prostitutes. It was also rumored that he developed a very strange sexual obsession, if it can even be called that, which consisted of tying up slaves, both male and female, as well as prostitutes, and then jumping on them in their private parts. But going back to the political situation, there was a growing sentiment against Neron, both in the Senate and among the Roman population. The economic crisis was worsening, and even the military felt disappointed. The legions in the provinces began to desert. The people even dared to boo him in the theater and in the Senate. So after years of several individual conspiracies, when his enemies realized that Nero no longer had any significant political support in the empire, the Senate decided to declare him a public enemy. On June 9th of the year 68, faced with a rebellion from the political class, Nero decided to abandon the capital. He hides in a villa he owns with no friends or family around, and he orders his loyal freedman Epaphroditus to end his life by stabbing him in the throat, putting an end to the life of this controversial Roman emperor. While it is likely that several of the terrible things that have just been recounted did happen, because it was a highly turbulent political context which, after years of glory, degenerated into a sea of intrigues and betrayals. It is also equally true that there is a strong black legend surrounding this figure, which makes it difficult and even impossible today to determine which part of these ancient stories was reality and which part was fiction. The historians Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio, among the few who detailed the stories of Nero, openly detested the emperor and had very bad opinions about him. Several of these stories may be part of rumors and even propaganda or inventions to make the young emperor look very bad, just as they could be completely true. Modern historians state that it was very difficult for the chroniclers of those times to have direct access to Nero's personal life. Therefore, many of their writings, especially those concerning his personal life, may be based on rumors or lies. For example, modern historians acknowledge that his wife, Poppaea, may have simply died due to complications during pregnancy or childbirth. Likewise, it is not known for certain whether Nero really caused the terrible fire of Rome, much less if he actually enjoyed it to the rhythm of his singing and his lyre. Another part of the story that is not so well known is that Rome experienced a golden age economically, culturally, and militarily during the early years of Nero's empire. The emperor enjoyed enormous popularity for a long time and was surrounded by prestigious philosophers like Seneca. He even went so far as to abolish terrible practices implemented by the former emperor Claudius Nero. He was very famous and loved by the people. However, he was hated by the Senate and other elites of Rome, who described him as an evil being. Thank you all very much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it a lot. And once again, I invite you to subscribe to our new channel, Mysteries of History. Don't miss the content we will be publishing there. Videos with unpublished, exclusive, and very interesting information with nothing more to add. Well, I also invite you to leave your likes and comments on this video. Subscribe if you haven't already to La Nueva Enciclopedia and follow us on our Instagram account called La Nueva Enciclopedia. Thank you very much to everyone, and may God bless you.